I'm Ben.
And I'm Thomas.
And today on the Philosophy Show, Axioms of Natural Philosophy.
And the sad state of the UK.
So I suppose we'll begin with natural philosophy, which, I don't know if you've looked it up since last we talked about it.
Oh, I can guarantee you I haven't.
Okay. Well, it's basically science without so much reliance on empirical data.
So does it still use natural laws such as physics and chemistry, or more rational principle type things?
It's more rational principles, but in a broader sense it can include
Natural laws?
Yeah, natural laws, even the mathematical formulation of natural laws.
All right.
Basically, pre-Newton about, I guess, or even later than that. All of science was basically called natural philosophy. So in that sense, it's pretty broad. But we're going to be using it in a more specific sense.
All right.
Here. So I tried to come up with as many axioms as I could. Well, not as many as I could, really, but I just tried to think of a few. As rational principles that one can rationally assume in doing science.
All right.
So the first one I came up with, I can't say I'm completely certain about this one, but I said for any two units, any combination of these units will be absolute if and only if both units are absolute.
All right. So my first question for you is, how do you define absolute?
Absolute meaning it's not relative to something else. So, well, maybe it could be relative to something else, but that would be it would be in a special sense. So, whereas absolute velocity would be something's velocity, well, absolutely, I don't know any other way to put it, or relative to space, I guess. Something's relative velocity would be its velocity compared to
something else,
some other object or some frame of reference or something like that.
All right. So if I were to give you a very, very simple example, I would be able to say that the velocity of this car is 80 kilometers, or relatively fast compared to that duck. Right, just a random example, but that'd be an example of non-absolute velocity. Whereas if I were to look at just the absolute velocity of the car, I mean, even then, a car moving, say, 140 kilometers per hour, would that still not be relative to the fact that the Earth itself is moving?
Well, that depends on what cosmology you assume. But in a geodynamic system, that would be correct. The car would actually be moving at like 100 million kilometers an hour or something like that.
Right. Okay, so I think I understand.
Well, not 100 million, that's like faster than the speed of light.
All right. I suppose when you by it depends on what
wait a second. No, it's per hour, so that would not be faster than the speed of light. Forget that I said that.
Okay. Okay. But in terms of you saying it depends on your, well, what you believe in terms of cosmology, are you referring to the ever-expanding universe theory or galaxy theory, that kind of thing? Or like it expands and goes back and everything's constantly in movement because the galaxy itself is expanding and shrinking?
I mean that you can have an alternate cosmological model that works, that assumes that something is at rest. You can have a model that works with our observations, that says that Jupiter is at rest or Earth is at rest, and things like that. Okay. And so you could assume...
So, all right, so assuming that model, then you'd be able to say that the speed of the car is absolute, if you're assuming that the Earth is not moving, so to speak.
Right. Of course, it depends on whether that model is actually true or not.
I think that's a whole other subject that we could spend hours discussing.
So, all right. What I meant by my first axiom was, suppose you have velocity and time, and you say that both of these are absolute, that velocity, or there could be relative velocity, obviously, but suppose you say there is absolute velocity, then if you make another measurement out of these, acceleration, which you have
acceleration.
Absolute velocity over time.
You're saying
acceleration
that would be absolute.
Would be absolute. And if you say that acceleration is absolute, then the things that is made of velocity and time must also be absolute.
Okay. I understand it in terms of theoretical principles. In terms of actual application, I'm not 100% sure if I'd be able to analyze the world and be like, absolute, absolute, not absolute.
Well, this is ontological rather than epistemic, I suppose. So my second axiom comes from Newton. I'm not sure it exactly lines up with what he meant by it, but absolute space, by which I mean that location is absolute rather than relative. There are relative locations, of course, but the absolute locations do, in fact, exist. So I'd take space to be like a multi-dimensional Cartesian plane in which things exist.
So, hypothetically, if I were to give another simple example, let's assume that the galaxy, or let's just use the galaxy in this case, is charted out in a Cartesian plane and is slowly expanding. The points on the Cartesian plane stay the same, however, what is in that point on the Cartesian plane is constantly changing as the galaxy expands or recedes, right?
Right.
Okay, that of course is just an example, assuming the galaxy expanding and receding theory. But I believe and I have an understanding of that, and I think that just thinking about it rationally, it does make sense. I have no reason to see why it wouldn't work.
Right. Well, I think it's contrary to general relativity, because in general relativity, space itself
is relative.
Well, space itself is said to move in some way, like it bends, and of course that
would
makes
that
me
be the
wonder,
theory of space-time, maybe? Gravity?
Yeah. Well, yeah, general relativity is about gravity.
All right.
And so, of course, that makes me wonder, how is space-time moving in a direction? Like, if it's moving in a direction, then doesn't there need to be some dimension that it's moving in? And wouldn't that dimension
so a space for the space to move in? Okay, I
Yeah.
see what you're doing there. It's kind of paradoxical in a sense, where if space-time moves based off of gravity, what it moves in is also another space. And okay. So you're kind of using that to refute the Einstein's theory of relativity in terms of space-time moving based off of gravity?
Yeah, I suppose so. Although you could just redefine his terms, and you could just say, well, there is this absolute space, but then this absolute space is filled with a second substance, which is called space within general relativity, and this substance bends within space and stuff like that.
All right. That seems fine. I mean, of course, neither one of us are theoretical physicists or quantum physicists, but in terms of looking at it from a natural philosophy perspective, I think that the absolute space does make sense from I suppose, empirical. Yeah, empirical physics perspective. I suppose it might be a bit harder to argue, but in terms of what I know, just sheerly using natural philosophy and what seems rational, it does make sense to me. Although I wouldn't say I could guarantee it, just because my understanding of Einstein's theory of relativity and absolute space and natural philosophy are somewhat limited.
Right. And also contrary to absolute space are people like, I think, Descartes and Leibniz, who hold that all motion is relative. So there isn't motion absolutely, there's just motion relative to other objects.
So by arguing that, he's arguing there is no absolute space?
Right.
Okay.
And so there's some things I thought to try to demonstrate this absolute space. That so the first one is suppose that there's a single indivisible object, which is the sole object in the universe. Even if there's no other bodies in this universe to compare this object to, we can still see that this object has a location.
Okay.
So we can see that it occupies limited space, because, you know, size is just a measure of the location that it takes up.
Right.
And it doesn't take up the whole universe.
Therefore, it must have an absolute location in the absolute space.
Right, despite there being nothing else.
Nothing else to compare it to.
Right.
If it needed something else to compare it to get its location, or its location was relative to something else, then it wouldn't be absolute its location. But if its location is not relative to something else, but just is in the universe on a Cartesian plane type thing that you described, then its location would be absolute.
Right. Actually, unfortunately, I don't think this works against Descartes' model of space, because Descartes thought the essential property of matter is spatial extension, and so therefore...
That can be quite problematic.
Therefore, he thought space itself must be matter. And so, in the universe of Descartes, in which there's only one object, that object would be the whole universe.
Okay, I was going to try to refute it, but it's kind of hard to refute what you just said. I was going to suggest the possibility of the pseudo-space, the space within the space, but I'm not sure that would work against that. What would you think? I mean, if the space is the universe, could you argue that that's kind of the greater space, and within that space is smaller space? I mean, that space being the specific space taken up by the objects, where the universe itself is space, but within that space is the pseudo-space I previously described.
Well, I suppose you could have that, but it wouldn't be Descartes' model.
Right.
And so the first objection or first argument just doesn't work against Descartes' model, as far as I see. And I have a second one. I don't know if it works against Descartes' model. I guess I'll find out when I remember how it goes. So if we take a universe that's finite in size,
Okay.
which is not the... It's not the modern conception of the universe from most people, but it's my conception of the universe anyway.
Okay.
And it's not, I don't think anybody takes it to be an impossible conception of the universe.
I certainly wouldn't consider it an impossibility. I wouldn't consider it a guarantee either.
So, at the very least, there could be a finite universe.
Right.
Now, if you take that old single object and put it in this universe, this finite universe, you can compare the location of this object to the universe. So you can say, okay, now it's in the center of the universe, now it's 2/3 from one side of the universe, now it's at the edge.
Of course, this only works given a finite conception of the universe.
Right. Well, I suppose in an infinite universe you might be able to say, well, it's not at the edge of the universe, but then that's kind of tautology. So I'm not sure if that works, but which means in a universe in which space works the same as it works here, an object could have absolute location, in which case it has absolute location here, even if our universe were not finite, which I think it is. Oh, and by the way, I'm not saying that absolute location or absolute velocity or anything is necessarily relevant in physics. It could be that when we find the fundamental formulas for physics, none of them even use absolute velocity or location. But my point is just that these things do exist.
All right.
My third axiom is objective time So, I don't know if I've discussed on this show before my theory of time.
Potentially, I don't recall. I know we've discussed it, I'm just not sure if we've put it on a philosophy show yet.
For now, I guess we can call it Lebellian time theory. I don't know if anybody else has come up with it before me. If they have, then I'll need to rename it. I think there might be some hint of it in Aristotle, but I'm not sure. So basically my theory is that time is composed of change. Change equals time. So time is like the progression from one maximal state of affairs to another.
And if there is no change in the state of affairs, no time has passed.
Right. So it's not as if, so if everything in existence were to freeze, quote unquote, in its current state,
then no time is passing.
Right, no time is passing. It's not like it could stay like that for 1,000,000 years. It would be no time at all between that and the next.
And you wouldn't be able to measure it because it's non-existent.
Exactly. And so also incorporated in there is my presentism. I hold that only the present exists, the past no longer exists, the future does not exist yet, which is common sense, I think, and a good many of philosophers accept it.
All right. In terms of the past, you said the past no longer exists. Well, I suppose based off of that conception of time, then yes, it does make sense that the past no longer exists. Yeah. All right.
And also the philosophers who accept presentism, they understand that this makes time travel impossible and time dilation impossible, so these philosophers actually reject special relativity. Well, they accept the equations and stuff, but they think the way Einstein explained how it connected to reality is not true. It's just an explanatory device that's useful in determining how the equations work and stuff like that.
All right.
And so, objective time, there's only one time. It's the same for anybody, etc. For number 4, I have something from Leibniz, principle of sufficient reason. For every fact, there is a sufficient reason why that fact is the case.
Right, and if there wasn't sufficient reason, then it wouldn't be a fact.
It wouldn't be the case.
Oh, I see what you did there.
So I'm not sure if that exactly goes against the current mainstream interpretation of quantum mechanics, because there are interpretations of quantum mechanics that are physically deterministic, but for the mainstream interpretation, it involves, I think, particles moving at random to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not sure if that would violate the principle of sufficient reason. You might say, is there sufficient reason that the particle moves in this direction rather than in that direction?
Well, I suppose that does bring up the question of the possibility that sufficient reason exists. We simply are not aware of it yet.
All right. I think that might disagree with the regular conception of quantum mechanics too.
All right, it's just something I thought of.
But it's not as if it would alter quantum mechanics to a significant degree.
No, and there is a possibility that sufficient reason exists. We simply do not perceive it. I don't see that being an impossibility or anything that wouldn't make sense, would you?
No. And there are many interpretations of quantum mechanics, and the equations stay the same. So we don't need to keep this randomness thing in quantum mechanics. And actually, I think the second most popular interpretation of quantum mechanics is the thing where the universe splits every time something random happens with particles.
It splits into all possibilities?
Yeah.
So like for every single possibility of anything different ever happening, and at the smallest form, that's, the smallest subatomic particle moving in a different direction, an alternate universe is created for every possibility. Therefore, every eventuality is all existing.
Right.
So if I were to put it simply, the multiverse theory.
Yeah, it's a version of multiverse. And it's not as if they have, like, evidence that this is the correct interpretation or anything. They just like this interpretation.
I mean, to be fair, it does make for good science fiction.
Well, I can't imagine writing science fiction like that. I mean, how would you have characters across different multiverses?
Well,
It's not like they could interact or anything.
Well, they wouldn't interact. The only thing is that science fiction, if you're to write about it, I do recall writing about it once in English class about 5 years ago. Of course, my interpretation of multiverse theory was essentially that they made a DC movie about it, where I'm not sure if you...
A cartoon movie?
Yes,
right?
yes.
I think I saw part of that on TV one time.
And of course, I was no theoretical or quantum physicist at the time, nor am I now. But the whole premise of the story is that a character, for whatever reason, is gifted with a brief understanding that his consciousness transfers from one possibility to another, and he tries to remind himself of a previous possibility he used to exist in, but he forgets, and that's kind of the tragic ending. Now, of course, that's not how it works. You wouldn't be able to remember because you were never there in the first place, but I did think it made for nice writing. But then again, I was never the greatest author in the 9th grade.
Sounds like quantum mechanics, multiverse interpretation, plus reincarnation.
Oh, that's some kind of strange pseudo-Hinduism. Ooh! This plot twist. Not only do you reincarnate in one of an infinite amount of universes. You could reincarnate as yourself. Ooh.
Yikes.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
All right. My 5th axiom is the uniformity principle, which is... It basically says that things will continue to happen pretty much according to the way they've happened in the past, which is something everyone assumes when they're inducing.
Alright, if I were to give it another name, would that be the positive natural order?
I don't know, I'm going to look that up.
Alright, sorry, it's just the terminology used by my philosophy teacher last semester, where the positive natural order is that if something, for example, the sky is blue, it's been blue as far as you could remember, it'll continue to be blue tomorrow. The positive natural order assumes that things will remain the way they are, and the sky won't just turn green the next day. And that's used in order to do any kind of scientific induction. Deduction, sorry. Any scientific deduction, you need to accept the positive natural order. And the only way to guarantee your acceptance of the positive natural order is some believing in the supernatural, whether it be Christianity or some kind of supernatural force that would guarantee natural order. To not exist in that, you couldn't guarantee the positive natural order, therefore you couldn't really do any science.
Well, I can't find anything about the term positive natural order.
So not posit, like P-O-S-I-T, like the posit of natural order.
Oh, positive
Sorry,
natural order.
sorry if I wasn't clear.
Maybe just natural order. It appears to be something about ethics rather than metaphysics.
Strange.
So
I always considered, well, maybe I'm mistaken.
maybe a
but
teacher misused the term or something.
maybe
The uniformity principle, I think that's the term Hume
Right.
uses. Because
Alright.
this was a problem with Hume. He was an empiricist, so he couldn't base the uniformity principle on intuition or anything like that.
Mhm.
But he couldn't base it on experience either, because that would be circular reasoning.
Right.
Because everything in the past has gone as it was before that, so in the future things will go as they were in the past. You're
Yeah.
assuming the principle, you're proving with that. So this was a problem with him, Hume, and I think it's a problem with empiricism.
Right. Assuming that what my teacher explained to be natural order is the uniformity principle, and we could substitute the past being the way things will continue as the sky being blue and continuing to be blue. Hume's issue with it is that the only way he could prove it empirically would be circular reasoning by using past experience. Would you agree with me in that the only way to accept the uniformity principle is some believing in the supernatural?
I would say indirectly, yes, because I suppose you could, well, I don't know. Because I suppose a rationalist who's a non-theist could say, well, they know this a priori. But then, of course, there's a question of how they got this a priori knowledge and why it's reliable. But then besides that, there's the concern of whether this principle would actually apply in a non-theistic universe at all. Like, what's to prevent the laws of physics from suddenly changing?
Right. Although, to be fair, you could make the argument that they just might, and they haven't happened yet, or they are and we're just not noticing. Or maybe, actually, no, I think those are the two things you could bring up. But I mean, you are right in that, hypothetically, for uniformity principle to be maintained over all of time, it would only make sense that it would have to be in a theological universe. However, I guess it's possible for things to, by some random chance, not random chance, but by something, they just stay the same. I mean, this is where you get into kind of tough questions about the reality of universe and theology. And I'm not maybe best suited to answer these questions, but for some reason I've seemed to accept the premise that you need to believe in some kind of theological universe in order to accept the positive natural order or the uniformity principle, to accept the uniformity principle and not some semblance or some kind of theological universe doesn't make rational sense.
I think I agree. You're a deist, right?
I suppose so.
Like a deist being...
Believing in some kind of supernatural God type thing.
Well, a deist would be... Let's see. Let's have Wikipedia tell us. Deism is a philosophical belief that posits that God exists as an uncaused first cause ultimately responsible for the creation of the universe, but does not interfere directly with the created world.
Right. And I suppose that could sum it up. I'm notorious for never taking full stances on these things, where I would say that does seem like an acceptable interpretation. However, I would say that I don't accept that that's the only possibility. I do believe that it's possible that other things are the case. I'm not willing to fully dedicate myself to one interpretation of the universe, which is kind of funny, really. But that one does seem to make sense for me for right now, so I suppose I'll stick with it as kind of a working theory. However, I wouldn't bet money on it. That's funny, betting money on the conception of the universe.
Well, there's what's it called? Pascal's wager.
Right, there is. I'm quite familiar with it, although to be fair, anybody could make a Pascal's wager for any kind of belief, so to speak.
Not for any kind of belief.
Okay, not any kind of belief, right? That was too general of a statement.
There couldn't really be a Pascal's wager in favor of atheism, really.
But couldn't any other religion use Pascal's wager to justify belief in their own God?
They could, but for the present, our subject is basically theism in general.
Right.
And that's what Pascal's wager establishes is...
belief in a God.
Yeah.
All right.
Also, I think your set of beliefs will become more specific when I bring out sometime in the future some arguments that I'm developing. I've been working on moral arguments because they're heavily underdeveloped in the literature. Anyway, Axiom 6. Theories contradictory to these axioms or self-contradictory are to be rejected. I think that's kind of obvious.
Right. I think self-contradictory, is self-explanatory. As for theories contradictory to these axioms, I suppose if you accept these axioms, that anything contradictory can't be accepted.
Right.
So, by definition, yes.
Yeah. Number 7. Theories deduced from these axioms are to be accepted.
I suppose it's kind of the opposite of number 6, so also yes.
Right. 8. Okay, this one gets kind of complicated, but I sort of thought I don't like the scientific method where you hypothesize and then you observe, then you hypothesize, and then you predict, and then you observe again and see if that validates your prediction. As if something about predicting something beforehand makes your theory more likely true than if you make a theory that fits the data afterwards. And yeah, it just doesn't.
So you're suggesting
not
that
really
basically
reasonable.
there's not really a point in making a hypothesis beforehand, or it's no
Well,
different.
there may be a point in making one beforehand, but the point isn't that predicting beforehand to make something more likely true.
Well, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of the scientific theory, predictions are made based off of prior observations, which is kind of what you're saying.
Well, predictions are made based off of hypotheses.
Which are made off of prior observations.
Yeah.
And would these prior observations not justify potentially a higher chance of your hypothesis being true, maybe? Is that what you're arguing against?
Well, more evidence would mean that your hypothesis is more likely true. But predicting that that evidence will exist before you in fact observe it doesn't make your hypothesis more likely true.
Well, I suppose making predictions before any observations making a hypothesis as opposed to not making a hypothesis based off of observations that you have yet to observe wouldn't make it any more likely to be true. Is that what you're trying to get at?
I think so.
All right.
In any case, the scientific method has no basis in formal induction. So a method I came up with that it's not perfect and needs to be perfected. Not even perfected. It's never going to be perfect, but it needs to be fixed a little. Something I call the estimated acceptance factor. I put estimated right in the name because it's not like objectively perfect at deciding what hypothesis is better than the other.
All right.
But I think it's close enough. So it gives a number that should be from 0 to 1. And theories, I think, below 0.5 should be rejected because they're probably not true. And if a theory is not rejected, then one with the highest estimated acceptance factor should be accepted. And I would like to put some kind of margin of error in there. Like, if one theory is higher than another, but it's within the margin of error of these theories.
Then either can be accepted as possible?
Not
or probable?
Like, neither can be accepted as better than the other.
Oh, okay.
Except on other grounds, like if one's self-contradictory or contrary to these axioms, or...
Alright, things related to the axioms.
Or even if you make a personal judgment that there's, like, an absurdity in these that's too strange to...
Possibly, although the thing with making that kind of decision yourself, I might argue that making that argument yourself might not necessarily make it true, just because it seems absurd. I mean, I suppose it depends on what you consider absurd. But I would argue that while that may make sense, I wouldn't be so certain that by the logic of something seeming absurd to you, it should be less accepted than another one that seems less absurd. Although I suppose intuitively that doesn't make any sense.
Well, I suppose, but if a theory says you have 12 million space dimensions that are each 2 billion meters across, then it's kind of absurd. And I think that would be, it would be warranted to distrust the theory just based on that.
I suppose so, and it all depends if the absurdity has any basis in observation. I think that things that could have possibly been considered absurd in the past that have since been proven by observation or other means that are accepted today can work. I think if we could accept that the thing that seems absurd should not be accepted until there is some kind of data or observation which would suggest it is less absurd than previously thought, then we should not accept it until that is the case. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I still think if something said that thing about the 12 million spatial dimensions, I would reject it.
On the grounds of absurdity.
Probably no matter how strong the evidence was. Well, not no matter how strong, there would be some level of evidence that could convince me. But it would have to be really, really big.
All right. I mean, it makes sense. My issue with your EAF as an acronym is that, I mean, I could be wrong in my understanding, but it almost seems dangerous in the sense that it's too open to the human fallacy of personal interpretation. Now, in actual practice, what your own opinions, whatever, shouldn't come into it at all. It should be purely based off of observation and reason and whatnot. However, humans are notorious for looking at the same thing and coming to different conclusions.
Right, but that would be, it would still be better than
the scientific method.
Than what we have now, which is like almost purely subjective, I suppose.
And the scientific method is based off of solely empirical evidence. Am I not mistaken?
I suppose it is, but I mean, if scientists were to say, well, this theory here is self-contradictory, they wouldn't worry about the scientific method. They would say, okay, it's self-contradictory, we can't use it.
All right, so you're saying no matter what the empirical evidence says, there should be some natural axioms which should automatically overrule empirical evidence to prove that things simply aren't.
That's rationalism.
Right.
So my EAF equals the average of the following things. Oh, it's going to be hard to say this from like written formula to... Anyway, okay, so you take the average of 1 over the number of competing theories, 1 over the number of unproven assumptions, 1 minus 1 over the number of things explained by the theory, and 1 minus the absurdity of the theory, ranked from 0 to 1. And you multiply that by the probability that the evidence will occur based on the hypothesis. So like the extent to which the hypothesis predicts the evidence, but not predicts in a sense that it has to come before, temporally.
All right.
And that over the probability of the evidence existing aside from, like without taking the hypothesis into account.
All right. Well, I do think you should be commended for trying to create an equation that would fit that rule. I think you would agree with me in that creating such an equation is no easy feat.
Well, it's easier than you'd think because I based it on an equation that already exists that's formally proven. It's called Bayes' theorem.
All right.
And the only difference is that instead of taking the average of all that stuff, it has probability of the hypothesis. And so, but there's a big problem of how do you decide what the probability of the hypothesis is?
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of philosophers just think, well, that's just subjective. You just subjectively decide what the probability of the hypothesis is.
Well, of course, that's no good.
So I just said,
let's get rid of the subjectivity.
I think we can sort of decide what the probability of it is by taking the average of all these factors here.
Now, I mean, some things do, I'm not saying you're wrong, I don't think I could possibly refute it, but I do think there are some potential issues I'd want to point out. Correct me if I'm wrong, but do variables such as absurdity, among others, have a certain level of subjectivity to them?
There is a certain level of subjectivity to that, but I think
it's not so great
I
that...
think a person can be reasonable in deciding that. Or we could even make a further formula to decide what the absurdity is, but I don't see how one would do that.
All right, so you're essentially saying most people are reasonable enough to give a reasonable level of absurdity, which would be deserved by certain hypothesis.
Actually,
Or theory,
my
rather.
preference would be if there was some kind of council of natural philosophers.
That would decide
like
what absurdity
minded.
was on different things. Where
Yeah.
you'd put forth a theory, and they would all come together and spend hours deciding what
the absurdity ranking is.
Well, I kind of like that. It kind of reminds me almost as if you had like a technocratic council back in the time of Greece, where you had a whole bunch of people in togas discussing such things, and behind them was, I don't know, it wouldn't even be a technocracy, it'd be a natural philosophical council. I'm not sure how any form of government could work based off of that. But I suppose it'd be like a technocracy, but based off of natural philosophy. That is quite interesting. I mean, it wouldn't even have to be governmental. It could be its own institute that would decide its things, completely independent of a government, if there is a government in said existence.
Wow, that's a weird idea. That has a high absurdity ranking.
Well, I would argue that's subjective. I mean, I would also argue... Ooh, that's actually an interesting one. How would you refute the possibility that such a thing is relative? For example, absurdity.
Absurdity.
I don't want to spend forever going on about absurdity.
Well, absurdity is, I suppose it's relative in some sense, because I think absurdity is basically the extent to which something contradicts common sense.
Right, which you would argue common sense, it's innate knowledge.
Right, of some kind.
And that is its own subfield of study, but we're not going to go into that right now.
That's all. Those are all the axioms I came up with for now.
All right, I suppose briefly, since I don't want to spend too much time, I'd like to go over a few non-philosophical things. For one, I'm not sure how many of you guys have heard, there's a couple of things going on in the UK, which would, I suppose, by rational people be considered, well, irrational, if not completely dystopic. Amongst a grand number of other things going on in the UK, recently there is a university student who voiced her support for Tommy Robinson in a class, and this was the first class of, well, the year for that class. I don't know what the subject of the class was, but she was essentially warned by the teacher that her views were not accepted here, and, well, she left the class. It was on her own volition. However, the whole outrage is that in such an academic place, there should be freedom of opinion and thought, and a professor shouldn't be able to tell you that your opinions, especially political opinions, are wrong and that you should change them to fit what the professor prefers in that class.
I suppose actually that might be reasonable to some extent. If somebody in the class is saying, all people who live in Toronto deserve to die brutally.
All right, okay. I suppose you could argue that such things are kind of relative in terms of free speech and threats. I would say you draw the line at, well, what's kind of currently considered free speech here, not Canadian free speech, because that doesn't exist anymore, but free speech in that as long as your speech doesn't impede on the rights of others, then I'm not talking about the right to not criticize Islam. I'm talking about not making threats against somebody's life or slandering them to ruin economic possibilities, telling lies about them. Of course, it's right to know the truth and lie and whatnot, but I used to think that it was within people's natural faculty to decide what's acceptable free speech and what's not, but my government has proven otherwise.
I suppose I might just add that I still don't, or at least, well, still, I don't know if I should. Anyway,
go ahead.
I don't accept free speech as a political law. I mean,
it doesn't have to be a political law. It could be.
I mean, my point is that I hold to property rights. And so I would have...
On your own property, you could say whatever you want, but ...
But if you're invited onto somebody else's property and you say something they don't want you to say...
They have the right to tell you to get off their property.
Right.
All right, that does seem actually quite reasonable. If they own the property, I would say that it's well within their rights to tell you to get off their property. I think that it is their right to say that, so I wouldn't argue that. However, in public spaces, especially ones such as universities and high schools and whatnot, essentially ruled by the government, who's kind of putting their own opinions into the minds of students, to start saying that anything opposed to that opinion is unacceptable. And I think you'd agree that having support for somebody such as Tommy Robinson, who hasn't committed any terrible crime, despite what the media would have you think, it is acceptable to have support for such a person and reasonable to not expect your professor to criticize you and tell you to change your beliefs in that class, as that class is not the professor's property and you have paid to attend.
Right, I agree with that. Unless I suppose it was in your contract when you paid to attend, it said you're not allowed to talk about these things or something like that.
Now, of course, if there was a contract, that's a whole other deal. However, I don't believe there was such a contract. Furthermore, there's another story about Tommy Robinson in that a group of soldiers took their picture with him a couple of days ago. I think it might have been a week or more now. Essentially, they were punished in that they had their phones confiscated, and apparently they are facing disciplinary actions, as well as potentially one of them being discharged. Now, of course, I'm not 100% sure on ones. My source for this information is the Rebel Media. I'm not sure because I'm not there. However, I would consider the source relatively trustworthy, and I have no reason to believe otherwise. All that to say, I think that when one person, a journalist, whose only crime, as far as I know, is breaking parole and going against the opinions of the government, when somebody like that, just by kind of taking a picture with them or announcing your support, there's legal action or such consequences taken against you, I would say that there's an issue in that one philosophy, or I wouldn't call it a philosophy, one ideology has far too much power and freedom is far too low.
Yeah, I would go with the non-aggression principle and say if you lock somebody up for some non-aggressive crime, in quotes, that itself is a
Crime?
yeah, crime by natural law in the political sense.
It all comes full circle. All right. Well, on that note, I'm Thomas.
And I'm Ben.
And this has been episode 7 of The Philosophy Show.
And remember, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Next time I think we'll be doing Battle of the Philosophers.